21st Sunday in Ordinary Time.
A reading from the book of Joshua. Joshua gathered together all the tribes of Israel at Shechem, summoning their elders, their leaders, their judges, and their officers. When they stood in ranks before God, Joshua addressed all the people. If it does not please you to serve the Lord, decide today whom you will serve, the gods your fathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose country you are now dwelling. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. But the people answered, Far be it from us to forsake the Lord for the service of other gods. For it was the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, out of a state of slavery. He performed those great miracles before our very eyes, and protected us along our entire journey and among the peoples through whom we passed. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for He is our God. The word of the Lord.
To destroy remembrance of them from the earth. Taste and see the goodness of the Lord. When the just cry out, the Lord hears them, and from all their distress He rescues them. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted, and those who are crushed in spirit He saves. Taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Many are the troubles of the just one, but out of them all the Lord delivers him. He watches over all his bones, not one of them shall be broken. Taste and see the goodness of the Lord.
A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians. Brothers and sisters, live in love as Christ loved us. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her to sanctify her, cleansing her by the bath of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So also husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one hates his own flesh, but rather nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church. The word of the Lord.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Many of Jesus' disciples who were listening said, "This saying is hard. Who can accept it?" Since Jesus knew that his disciples were murmuring about this, he said to them, "Does this shock you? What if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life, while the flesh is of no avail. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But there are some of you who do not believe." Jesus knew from the beginning the ones who would not believe and the one who would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by my Father." As a result of this, many of his disciples returned to their former way of life and no longer accompanied him. Jesus then said to the 12, "Do you also want to leave?" Simon Peter answered him, "Master, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and are convinced that you are the Holy One of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
The 21st Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading comes from the book of Joshua 24, 1-2 and 15-18. In this passage, Joshua leads the people to make a covenant with God of Israel. They had left Egypt during the Exodus, and it was a mixed group of people. There were certainly the Israelites, but there were also many slaves who left along with the Israelites because the going was good. Now they're entering the Promised Land, and Joshua invites them to choose their God. He doesn't force Yahweh upon them, but he tells them that he and his household will serve God, and they will be faithful to the God who brought them out of Egypt. He invites the others to do the same, and in fact, they do proclaim that this is the God who brought them out of slavery, and therefore they will serve him as well. The second reading is from Ephesians 5, 21-32. In this passage, we hear what amounts to a piece of Stoic philosophy. Stoicism was a very common philosophy at the time of Jesus and at the time of Paul, and it spoke especially about obligations. And in this passage, we hear that a wife has an obligation to obey her husband. This is the order that God ordained in the universe, and we have to follow this order. Now, if this particular reading were written today, then it might be written slightly different. It probably would talk about mutual obligations. But when you come down to it, even this reading talks about mutual obligations. Unlike standard Stoic philosophy, which just emphasizes the idea of the obedience of the wife to the husband, this reading also emphasizes the obligation of the husband to love his wife. He shouldn't lord it over her. He shouldn't try to control her, but rather he should lead her in a holy way, much as Christ leads the church. And in fact, in this passage, we hear the example of Christ and his union to the church as being a symbol of a matrimonial union. Now, this is very odd because Paul, when he talks about marriage, doesn't really see it as a great thing. In 1 Corinthians, it's almost as if he says, you shouldn't get married because the Lord is coming back in glory. But if you have to, do it, but it's not the greatest thing. If you have to just to prevent yourself from falling into mortal sin, then I guess it's okay. Here, there's a very positive symbol of marriage. And this is one of the reasons that we don't believe that Paul wrote Ephesians. It's Pauline, written in his school, but probably not written by Paul himself. The Gospel is from John 6, 6-69. This is the end of the discourse on the bread of life. Jesus speaks about how it's the Spirit that gives life, not the flesh. Now that's rather odd because he's been talking about the fact that the bread of heaven is his flesh for the life of the world. In that case, flesh was presented as his material self, The same thing we find in the prologue when we hear that the Word became flesh. But in the usage that we hear today, it almost sounds as if flesh is used in the Pauline sense, our fleshiness, our worldliness. And this gives us an indication that the Bread of Life discourse was probably written at two stages. Remember a couple weeks ago we saw that Jesus presented himself as the bread of life, which was wisdom incarnate. Well, he goes back to that idea that he is wisdom and therefore he is the spirit that gives life, as opposed to the flesh, our fleshiness, which doesn't. Many people who were following Jesus go away because his saying is too difficult. It sounds as if he's proposing cannibalism. So Jesus turns to the 12 and says, "What about you?" At this point, Peter gives a tremendous profession of faith. "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life." That Peter, who is not presented all that positively in this gospel, nevertheless is able to proclaim his entire trust in the Lord. Now, in a verse that is not included in the passage today, but which follows immediately, we almost hear a bit of a put down of Peter and the 12. "Yeah, but one of you is going to betray me." It's almost as if the Gospel of John can't portray Peter in a positive light. The Gospel is always contrasting Peter, who doesn't quite get it, and the beloved disciple, who is in love with the Lord, presenting the beloved disciple as a perfect paradigm of what it means to be a true Christian. The Eucharist is a bit of a scandal, because how can we possibly believe that that piece of bread, that cup of wine, is truly the body and blood of Christ? It's something that's impossible to explain because it's a mystery, and yet we believe it, we trust it, because we know it's true, that when we receive the Eucharist on Sunday, something changes in our hearts and our lives. We find a certain peace, the peace that only Christ can give us. And may God bless us.